Okay, I'm Kyle Banerjee, and this is Brooks Travis, and we're both data implementation consultants from EBSCO, and we're going to talk about using the APIs. We're going to divide this into like two broad sections. Now, the most important thing is that this is actually useful for you. So that means that we do not expect you to sit there and listen politely. When we're helping people with the APIs and we're doing implementations, the very first thing we do is we ask, what kind of things would you like to do? Because otherwise it's kind of like, well, if you wanted to learn how to cook and someone gives you like this broad theoretical thing about ingredients and methods and all that kind of stuff. And the Folio API is like that. Everything is driven by what you want to do. And so if you're not hearing things that will help you do what you're going to do, bring them up and we'll talk through it and hopefully make it useful. So be sure to speak up. I'll go ahead.
Yeah. In this session, we're going to cover kind of a high-level description of the Folio APIs. Kind of talk about where to get information about how to use the APIs, API documentation, kind of tips and tricks, places to find things online. We're going to walk through the process of connecting and authenticating for the Folio API system. Talk about free tools that are available to work with the APIs, things like Postman, command line tools. We're going to do kind of an introduction and demo for some of these things. So we'll kind of get started with what do you need to connect to the APIs? And definitely, as Kyle said, jump in with questions if you have them as we kind of go through this. We'll be a couple places where we're going to actually stop and say, do you have any questions? But we don't have to wait for those.
Actually, one of the things to know is we have a very diverse audience here. And this is kind of like normal. Like I can recognize some people who have been doing APIs for a gazillion years. We will have stuff in here that will be useful, that will save you time. We also have people in here that I suspect they're kind of like trying to wrap their minds around what exactly API is. You do not need any particular background to get started. So that's the good news. And even if you're an old hand at this, you will also find something useful. And like Brooks said, we're going to be talking about some of the tools you can use, how you get started. I want to go and flip to the next slide for a couple of definitions. We will try to refrain from excessive jargon. Do call us out if we say things that don't make any sense. Working for a proper corporate environment, we speak alphabet soup. I believe, though, that all the academic places I've worked also do this, but you cannot hear your own accent, as it were, and so sometimes we'll use these terms without thinking about it. However, in Folio speak, there are some things that you're going to encounter so often that the jargon is actually useful. Like we'll talk about authentication tokens. That's basically the credential you use for making a request, token rotation. The good news is we're going to tell you don't even have to worry about it. Don't think about it. Know that it exists, and you're going to hear this word endpoint, the URL. It's basically what are you calling with your client, and the client could be anything, including a web browser. As the client itself, curl, Postman, a number of other things. Using it there. And then the API gateway, you'll hear it referred to as Okapi sometimes, but that will be changing with the new Eureka platform, which is why we're calling an API gateway. And then the tenant itself, which is kind of like a logical collection of Folio data. And so you can have many libraries on one tenant, or you can have many tenants, or you can actually have multiple tenants for one library. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. There are two main types of APIs, because you'll hear the Folio API. The vast majority of the time you're going to be talking to what is known as a gateway API. When you are using the web interface, you're using the gateway API. When you are writing something to import users or modify something again, you're going to be using the gateway APIs. But the edge APIs are for very specific integrations, like your discovery layer. It could be for
Gobi
orders, your
SIP2,
yeah,
and SIP2.
They're very specific integrations, and so when you're trying to customize stuff don't even worry about the edge APIs. Broadly speaking, APIs communicate in JSON. Tomorrow, I'll be doing a different session on speaking in JSON because you need to be able to read it and create it. And whenever what the communication using the API is basically a matter of receiving JSON messages and sending JSON messages. It's all that. And then the other thing is when you're generating authentication tokens, you are using regular user credentials. Everybody is an API user. If you are a staff member, you are an API user. When you're using that web browser, what's really going on, and we'll see later how you can see what you're doing, is you are using your credentials to generate an API token, which is then making API calls. And again, we'll show you how you can look at that. In general, you can retrieve records in bulk using the APIs. Some of them are throttled to, they're throttled so you can get a maximum amount. Others are unthrottled, but server response might cause you to
we'll get into particulars.
We'll get into the particular. And
but mod search is a great example. If you try to throw anything more, if you try to ask for any more than 100 records from mod search at a time, it'll give you a 500 error.
Right. And
Or
so,
fortunately, I can't remember which.
it will give you something not helpful.
Yes.
And so we'll talk about that. Fortunately, it's not a big deal. You can actually harvest millions of records from a Folio installation. And then we had our asterisks for the edge APIs because they speak XML or whatnot, or specific protocols.
SIP2 is itself a message protocol. Right. It's spoken by one of the edge APIs.
And the edge APIs, they authenticate differently. They'll actually have an API key and stuff like that. But in general, when someone says, what's the API key? Use your user credentials, add whatever permissions you need, and that will allow you to do it. If you don't add the permissions, when you try to make the API call, you won't be able to do it. All right, for the next one.
As we mentioned, there are several types of gateway APIs. You've got the search API. So these are things that are driven by the mod search module. So these are inventory search and authority search are the two primary uses of those kinds of APIs right now. They're driven by an open search backend. They have a little bit different behavior around queries and the way, like I said, 100 records at a time is the maximum you can get from those APIs. Storage. These are very fast and flexible APIs. If you're talking directly to the storage APIs, you can manipulate that data basically in almost any way you want that complies with the field level validation of that data. So if it needs to be a number and it's not a number, it's going to yell at you. But other than that kind of thing, as long as you have all the required fields there, you can basically set whatever you want. That has some drawbacks, which we'll come to here in a minute. New Folio releases sometimes can change or deprecate gateway API behavior. This is driven largely by the needs and desires of the front-end development. So if something needs to be changed about a gateway API to support front-end development, that's going to happen at the expense of being able to maintain backwards compatibility in that API. So if you are using the gateway APIs, you do want to make sure you're kind of staying up to date on the change logs and things that are put out for each release of Folio, because those breaking changes will be noted there most of the time.
We learn about those the same way as you do. We are just members of the community. There is no secret sauce.
Yeah.
And so like our own tools, they get, we have to adjust them. And so, but fortunately, people don't, they don't adjust the APIs without a reason, but yeah, you do have to pay attention. There's some bulk APIs for doing mass changes that you really want to be aware of because it is so much faster. We're talking multiple orders of magnitude. If you have thousands or even hundreds of thousands of records, you want user import, do not use the user's API. All of the
We'll come back to an exception to that towards the end of the presentation. I've got something to talk about, but yeah.
Right, and then there's others for like items, holdings, instances, SRS. Not for most of the other types, but a lot of times what people need to do is they need to do a bulk change. Like I need to modify 1 million items or stuff like that. Now, there's some catches, because with optimistic locking and all that kind of stuff, you have to send the right versions, you have transactions, all this kind of stuff going on. If you send something with the wrong version, and if you have a single record out of the batch that's not good, the whole thing gets chucked. But again, if you're doing a mass change, you really, really, really do not want to be using like a serialized process one at a time. Actually, what I recommend threading it and bulking it at the same time, and then it will go fast.
You have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of using a large batch with the possibility of an error occurring in that batch, and then kind of balance that. And you can catch those, like, catch those batches that fail, set them aside, and come back to them at the end, and then post them serially one at a time. That way, you'll see the exact record that caused the error, and you can just pull it out and pull the new version of that record and maybe, apply the changes to it that you had before.
One really low-tech way of dealing with that, if you think that the possibility of error, is just to run the process, forget the errors, do another search which finds all the stuff that has the errors, and then, I mean, you can, there's the clean way of doing it, but a lot of the times you're doing one-off processes. And with the one-off processes, you can get away with a lot of stuff that, well, it depends on what you're doing. That's why we're going to have adequate questions and answers. Yeah, the other thing I had at the very bottom, you'll really, since you're beginning working with the storage layer, you can hose yourself. If you're EBSCO hosted, we will help at you. We won't laugh. Well, okay, we might, but you won't suffer any ill consequences. But when you're writing directly to storage, you can do things that cause you trouble. So be careful.
And test.
Yeah, definitely.
Run tests.
You've mentioned that when you run one of these a batch job using the batch APIs, if one record is wrong and does not work with the proper, the whole thing.
The whole thing. So like,
the whole thing just dies.
right. And so we do different sizes. I personally, regardless of the size of the operation, like even with tens of millions, I actually tend to do it in batches of 250. You use larger.
Yeah, depending on how your hosting environment is configured, how many tenants there are in your cluster, all those kinds of considerations, and how busy the system is. If you're running overnight, you can probably get away with larger batch sizes. But I typically do between 750 and 1,000 at a time. Again, that's a balancing thing. So how likely do you think it is you're going to have bad records in those batches? If you feel like you might have quite a few of them, the 250 might be a better route. That way you have fewer batches that fail, fewer records that fail because of one single bad record in the batch.
Yeah, it also that. Yeah, it's kind of like I actually will bump it up if like I know that the data is clean. If it's item records, there's a little bit of alchemy in that because what you really want is the easiest, fastest process. But yeah.
One of our colleagues, Kevin,
he does 750, and so it's sort of like you'll want to feel it out. You'll know when you got it right. Okay, we can jump on to the next one.
This is a little bit more about storage APIs. These are the fastest way for individual changes to any record type that has. Some of the modules in Folio have just a single API. There's no storage and business logic distinction. There's just APIs. But inventory, circulation, all have a business layer, a business logic layer, and a storage layer in their API structure. You can only modify individual records by UD except for the batch options we met before. You can search. You can use SQL searches in both the business logic APIs and the storage APIs, but only things that appear in the storage record as non-virtual attributes of the JSON objects can be searched using SQL. It has to be present in the storage object for it to be searchable. These don't engage business logic. So if you change an item status to checked in via the storage layer, that's the status of the item, but there's nothing to actually have checked it in. There's no routing slips generated or anything like that. You're just literally setting up the string value in the record because that's what statuses are, they're string values.
And you literally can't check it in, nor can you check it out. And it will.
Checked in, you can do whatever you want to because that's not a status that governs it.
Right, you can cause yourself some funny headaches.
If something is on loan and it's checked in, that can get weird.
Although this is actually a fairly powerful, because when you're doing it in batches using CQL, you can pull the batch, modify it and post it. So like, even if you have a lot of them, there's no rule that says you have to get everything before you change it. You can pull and modify at the same time.
And you definitely want to do a sort if you're doing that, because
Absolutely.
if you try to page through records as you're modifying them,
Yeah, you'll change the sort.
the order of returning from the database changes, and you'll find yourself, why am I only modifying half the records I thought I was going to be modifying when I started this process? That's because every time you made changes, you've skipped some of the records because the database reordered the way it returns records to you.
Sort by ID.
Yeah.
Always by ID.
And sort by an indexed field, definitely sort by an indexed field.
Yeah.
That
Always.
Yeah, 'cause ID is always indexed, so.
Yeah.
That's a safe one. Oops, sorry, jump 2 slides. Nope, no, sorry.
Okay, business logic APIs, because now one of the things is when you're looking at the API documentation, it won't say this is a business logic API, and actually the storage.
If it says storage, it's a storage
storage,
API.
right.
If it doesn't, it's not a storage API.
Right, but there are some storage APIs that don't say storage.
Oh.
Users,
Well, users doesn't have business logic layer. There's the users BL module, but that's not really
Same
applicable to this.
but the most important thing is the business logic APIs have a layer of abstraction. They're actually designed to work with workflows. For example, if you're checking books in and out, what's really going on is everything's going to ultimately be tied down to UUIDs. But when you're doing things, they'll have like a checkout thing where you scan a barcode of a user, you scan a barcode of an item, and so you do so the checkout by barcode API is what you use, and so the business logic APIs will themselves call other APIs, and they can be very useful. Like in terms of inventory, a very common question people will say is, oh, I want to report, I want the call number here, I want it sorted by location, I want the title and all that kind of stuff. And if you did that by storage layers, you'd have to stitch together, you'd have to take your items, find the holdings from that, find the inventory, and that's a pain in the neck. Or you can use the inventory API, where it not only gives you the entire hierarchy at one time, it actually translates a lot of this stuff to plain English, so you don't have to resolve that. So that's the good news. The bad news is they're a lot slower, and so which you want to use is going to depend on what is exactly your need, what's the scale of the need. Like as the scale of your problem goes up, it becomes worth figuring out, oh, do I really need to do business logic, or am I going to be better off with storage? But for small processes, you want to
And you can do large processes through business logic, especially if that, resolution of reference data is important to you, being able to pulling. If you do the storage for things like location and contributor type and instance records, you're only going to get a UUID. The business logic APIs for inventory resolve those things to actual string values, so you can have a meaningful name for those things. It makes building the reports a lot easier later on. But you can do those in smaller batches, and just if you need to pull all those records out and do an offline report on those, an offline analysis on those, you can do that. It just it's a balance of what your needs are in terms of what fields you want present in the record you pull out, and how much work do you want to put into like stitching things together if you needed to resolve those reference data values. Yeah, and doing these, I definitely recommend 100. You limit your batches to about 100 when you're using the business logic APIs. That's what the UI does for the most part. If you do go and do a search and inventory and you're looking at the results list, they're paged in pages of 100. There's a reason for that. The API used to be a lot more unstable at large batches, where you could get yourself into a lot of trouble with the actual system load by trying to query more than that. And there were some things because the business logic APIs have to call the storage APIs, and so they're issuing their own queries and encoding those queries. The queries are getting too long, things would go awry. But that's gotten better. But you can still run into problems.
Although, broadly speaking, when you're doing mass updates, especially if you're working on regular inventory like holdings, items, and stuff like that, I'd really recommend hitting storage rather than business logic for mass updates in general.
Yeah, because the API object, the JSON object you send back to those storage APIs, for those batch updates need to be the same schema. Like they need to have the same fields and everything that are in storage. If you try to send it business logic API returns, it's going to fail because it won't recognize the fields you're asking it to update. when you're working in the Folio UI and you open a record to edit it in the, the interactive form for editing a record in inventory, it's pulling down the storage record and using that to construct the form in the UI. Zach, feel free to correct me on that. But yeah, so, and then when it posts it back, it's putting back the storage object. It may put it back to the business logic API, but it's the storage object.
And we've already talked about this a little bit. The main thing to know about the Edge APIs is that they're special use external integrations specific to you're not going to be using those except for when you first get set up. You're going to be wanting to work with discovery, equipment, stuff like that.
There are a few
resource
things
sharing.
around OAI PMH you might want to consider setting up if you're wanting to do any kind of
Yeah.
periodic harvest of your catalog into an external system. Setting up OAI PMH might be an option for that.
Yeah.
Because that includes some holdings and item data for doing incremental, building a system that you incrementally update. OAI PMH can be a good way to harvest that data into a system like that.
Unless OAI PMH doesn't have what you want.
Right. As long as the records have what you need. There are kind of, like we said, there's two major types of authentication for Edge APIs. There's a pre-generated API token, where your hosting site will basically generate an Edge API token for you, and you include that in all of your requests to that Edge API. Or you have integration-specific authentication. So these are, SIP2 authentication, or there's an inReach integration for Folio that uses the inReach protocol for doing the OAuth authentication that it needs to do to support that protocol. But those kinds of things.
And these next couple of slides are mostly to make you aware of places you can look up. Like when you're using CQL, how do I know what I can do with CQL? We'll make the slides available, you can find the URLs and stuff like that. But the thing that's kind of important to notice is it will help you design rather complex queries. In all honesty, one of the things I do a lot is I'll send a query that's actually a lot broader. Trying to do everything in CQL can be awkward. And so what I personally do a lot of times is I send something broader and then cut through the JSON later.
Say this is a spoiler for your presentation.
Yeah. JQ for the win. Like, if you're not using it, you need to reevaluate your life choices. Yeah. But then we can go to the next one. Oh, the manual. This is really, really handy. This is normally there's the most useful thing is when you go to the manual, you'll see a nice list of everything. Now, when you first start going there, it's kind of like if someone asked you, if you said, "Oh, I just arrived in London. Where's a great place to eat?" And well, on the internet, they list all the great places you can eat. And it's like, well, awesome. Unfortunately, going into the dev manuals, kind of like that, but there's also an incredible amount of useful information. So you can see what are the endpoints associated with each thing, what methods does it support, what is required of it. So like when you're trying to get, both syntax, what's it supposed to do, what does it not do? That's a very good place to start. And let's go ahead and jump to the next one. This is a low-tech, you're like, I don't really want to read the manual. Just put your browser in developer mode, hit that F12 button and light up the network tab. And you can see all the API calls, the messages going out, the messages coming back, because one thing that you know is that the UI sent the message and you got a response, that if you sent that same message,
that's the response you
yep.
get.
And
so, a good place to start, even if you're perfectly comfortable looking at the documentation, is to perform the action you want to perform in bulk via the UI. Do that one record, create a record, update a record, do it in the UI, look in the developer tab at the network and see what was sent, see what was received. Because that's what you need to replicate whenever you're trying to automate this in some way.
When you say UI, do you mean
the Folio?
Okay.
Log into Folio
as a staff member,
as a staff user, using the same credentials you use to make the API calls. Do the thing, see what it does.
Okay.
Like in this case, one of the things we could tell is we just did a item get is what that was, and so we have. I mean, you can see what the header is, what the request actually, we must have posted or something like that. We don't have enough of it lit up, but had we had enough of it lit up, you'd be able to see.
Yeah, that's the foot, that's the update.
Yeah, must have updated a record. But you can, one of the things you can also see, especially when you're creating new record types and stuff like that, you'll often find that you need much less than is listed. So you can simplify your life, like.
More complicated.
Yeah, no, it's true, it's.
More knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, but it's,
There are no required fields in users, FYI. If you're creating a user record in Folio, there are no required fields. You can post an empty JSON object, it will create a record for you with a UUID, and that's all it has to have. Didn't used to do that way back in the day. You posted an empty JSON object, it would give you an error telling you needed to display a UUID. I filed a bug because that was not in compliance with the documentation for that API. It got fixed. People are still annoyed at me for it, I think. Anyway.
But yeah, actually, this is a good place to start in many cases. Do the operation in there, see which endpoint was consulted, then go to the documentation to get the correct, that's a very good order. And that way you'll also find a better way, because otherwise you can wind up searching through a lot of API endpoints.
Yeah, you need to know what module services that endpoint that you want to call in order to find it in the documentation. Whereas here, it's being driven by what you're trying to accomplish, and you can just see the endpoints and then go find them in the when in doubt, learning APIs channel on Folio, ask there if you can't find the link to the documentation for whatever reason.
There's some very good people on that list, and so people of all levels, from just getting started to really good, and we monitor it, so you will not get hung out to dry. If nobody answers,
someone will answer.
Yeah, someone will.
I have a compulsion.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, and also you'd be helping anybody else, because what happens is, now there's a librarian illness where people won't ask the question unless they kind of know the answer already. That kind of like kills the purpose of asking questions. When you ask a question, especially in a public forum, you are helping everybody else who has that same question. So do not be shy about this stuff. It really, really does. You'll help not only yourself, but others.
And the slides are posted to the session. It's good.
Yeah. Oh, and now we have the postman part. One of the things, now this is actually kind of new. We are putting together some like intro to postman. Actually, maybe what we'll do is go to the next slide and see what gives you sort of like a brief what's going on with postman. Postman is a graphical API client, so that you can point and click and stuff like that. And so what the basic process does is you set up your tenant. In this case, we're just using Bugfest. There are some environmental variables. So you put your copy URL, your tenant ID, username, password, all that kind of stuff in your environment. And then in the collections, those are the API calls themselves. And so that way, when you see how, and we'll do
a live demo.
Well, yeah, exactly. And so what you do is you just substitute your own information here. You use the same collections that are there, and also other things that people tell you and that you figure out yourself.
In the upper right-hand corner, you can see there where it says Bugfest Quiznalia up there. That's where you select and activate the environments that you configure. So you can have multiple environments set up. So if you've got a production system and a test system and a staging system, and you want to do different operations in those, you can configure environments for each of them, and then you don't have to change the collections. You can use the same collection, select your environment, and that's how you perform your operations.
I mean, the hardest part is like as you do more and more stuff, is the explosion of
environments is your friend. When I started using Postman, I created a new collection for every single system I was connecting to. Do not do that. Madness. That way it is.
Let's see you go. Oh, show the utilities. Now the free stuff you get on the internet is worth every penny that you paid for it. But there's a lot of useful stuff there. If you use Bash or stuff like that, there are, I don't know how many utilities there are.
So many.
It's over 350, and they do interact with absolutely every area of Folio, doing all kinds of things. Hopefully the names like account deletes accounts, that type of stuff. But there's a couple in particular that are actually useful like the records.
Is that fines
What's
account? Is that fee fine account?
Yeah.
Okay.
But some of them, they'll be like records get, which is a very broad thing that will get any kind of records, which you can send it UUIDs, you can send it CQL query, you can send it nothing, and it will get everything it knows, and it knows the syntax, how many records you can get, how many threads you can do simultaneously. So some of them have a little bit of intelligence built in, and so also there's update scripts. So like generally speaking, if there's the significance of the things in that list is there is regular need, we've had regular need for them, and so they exist because we do throwaways like, oh, so many times per day, I don't even know, but things that there's some regular need for, they kind of like find their ways there. So if you do bashy type stuff, it's not a bad place to look.
We also have a Python module called Folio Client that we maintain. This will basically allow you to create an authentication session with Folio, it has convenience functions for performing get, put, and post. No delete. I don't give people guns to shoot themselves in the feet. As we mentioned earlier, deleting records is somewhat fraught with peril. Actually, that's going up, sorry. This The Folio client handles token rotation for you. So once you've created an authentication session in Folio, we created a Folio client object in Python. That client object maintains a valid authentication token for you for every request. So if you're working in Python and you don't want to roll your own authentication stuff, this is a great option for you to use. And it's pretty lightweight. It has some convenience functions for getting reference data, but we'll kind of get into some of that a little bit later.
Okay, this is a little bit of a warning and heads up. The next couple slides, since we have a diverse audience, is like, if you're old hat with this is all going to seem really basic. But I also think that if you're just getting started, it's actually very useful to go through this to realize how simple this all is. And so one of the key things, APIs have a lot of intimidating language around them. A GET request, you have a machine, your client is connecting to another machine and literally sending the word GET followed by some information. When you're posting information, it's not a different process. You are connecting to an endpoint. You are literally sending the word post along with some information. When you send put, it's literally the word put. It is that simple. There is only text going back and forth, and we're gonna like look at the mechanics of it. And it's the reason is I find that especially people who haven't worked with this stuff before, it feels like some kind of magic or it feels intimidating. I'm just telling you, this is all simple stuff that you don't need any background to understand.
And if you go online at all, you were doing this thousands of times a day.
Absolutely. So well, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Party like it's
Earlier we mentioned refresh tokens in the terminology section. I put this slide in here. Someone mentioned I should maybe include something about this. I talked about it a little bit when I was talking about the Folio client library in Python. Beginning in Poppy, Folio supports expiration of authentication tokens. It will be required as of Ramson's. Oh, Quiznalia? Oh, yes, right. Yeah, required as of Quiznalia. Prior to Poppy, tokens were effectively immortal. They were valid for as long as they existed. Those are deprecated, and in Quiznalia they go away. It could have not worked at all depending on your hosting configuration prior to that. There's a new endpoint for these. It's authn, which is the same kind of base level of the API for login, but this login with expiring endpoint. This endpoint does not return the token. If you do the old login endpoint, it would return the token in the body. So you get a JSON object back that had the authentication token in that JSON object. The new one does not. It sends back expiration times for both the authentication token and what's called a refresh token. Authentication tokens are very short-lived, relatively speaking. And that's configurable at the hosting level how long they're valid for. Browsers use what's called a refresh token to request a new authentication token. If you're writing any kind of scripting thing to interact with Folio, the recommendation is to just re-authenticate when you need a new token. So your token's expired, you need to get a new token, just log in again, do the same login call to get the token like we would do to start. This login with expiry endpoint returns the token in cookies, session cookies, which is a way of including things in the headers of an HTTP response. The cookie you're looking for is the Folio access token cookie. So anything that pulls that out, if you're writing anything that authenticates and needs to retrieve that token, that's where you're going to pull it from. Unless you're building a progressive web app, don't worry about refresh tokens. That's the recommendation of, there's a page I'll have a link to later on in the presentation that talks about the reasoning behind and the kind of the design and thought around the refresh token implementation in Folio. And the recommendation of the folks that implemented this is to just re-authenticate with your username and password the same way to get a token to begin with. Speaking of generating an authentication token, this is kind of the JSON body that you would send to again, that's the login into the endpoint that you would use. You need to include your tenant ID in the header. So there's an XOCopy tenant header, and the tenant ID needs to be included there. So this is in the software version section of settings. You'll have both your API endpoint URL, base URL, and your tenant ID. How your hosting environment is set up. It could be the name of your institution if you're self-hosted, probably, or if you're hosted by EBSCO, it's going to be FS something, or CS something if you're in an ECS environment. Again, this process sets a token in a session cookie, so you need to retrieve that. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the deprecation of the login endpoints is, I'm pretty sure that when we look at that page later on, I can click on that link to that page that talks about the refresh token. There's the thing at the top of that page that says exactly when, on the community side, at least it will be going away.
That will matter for like places that don't have, where you have some external IT shop doing the integrations.
Yeah, and you need time to update that.
And this is kind of like the mechanical part. This is, if we didn't need a secure connection, you could have used Telnet, a program written in 1969 to do API calls. And the only point of this slide is to show you how simple this is. I literally typed this out. Everything that an API sends, every bit of it is something you can see with your eyes and you can type with your fingers. Like this, I type this thing out, blah, 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 post, as you can see, you probably can't see it because it's microscopic, but if you can see it, it would say the word post with the endpoint and then some stuff about the server, and those are what are called headers. So like headers, boy, that looks like plain text. It is, that's all there is. XOCopy tenant. The only significance, new line in front of it, something says XOCopy tenant, you get the response. And a cookie, interestingly, it says cookie. That's what distinguishes a cookie from a response header. It's literally that simple. And so then the one that says, the cookie that says access token, that's the cookie that's the access token. You take the text, or your client takes the text. And so when you're working with Python or whatever you're working with, all it is doing this. You're using your web browser, that's all that's happening.
HTTP, one of those Ds, the first one, stands for text.
Yeah. And then when your token comes through, you see your access token expiration. Let's see. Refresh token expiration, Folio access token, blah, blah, sends the thing through, tells you how long it lasts, all this kind of stuff. That's literally all there is to it. Every single call you do, that's all that's happening, whether it's post, delete, you name
Let's imagine a scenario.
Okay.
Where there's a Python script that's already written and running.
Right.
Just fine. And moving into the new regime.
Right.
Login with expiry. What would be like, is there a specific HTTP error that will come back?
Yeah, your token's gonna be bad because you won't be able to generate a valid.
Yeah,
Would that be like a 403 or a?
I think it comes back as a bad request.
Yeah.
Okay.
Authorization error. Right.
It includes, there's some stuff about like the specific there, but I think it's a generic bad request code.
Yeah, because what you'll need is you'll need to have
when I pull up I have my Folio client stuff open in my VS Code on here, and I can kind of bring it up there. I can look and see exactly how I'm seeing that, but I would highly recommend switching over to the Folio client library to handle your authentication to that. And then just pull the headers. If you don't want to completely, it has the thing you need to do to like, you know, create client that you can use and manage but if you just switch out how you're specifying your authentication token header to use, actually just the headers in general, to use the header, copy headers object on the Folio client object, it will like it automatically, it's a property on that object that automatically makes sure that the token it's using is valid. So it looks at the expiry and checks it compared to an offset from like difference between expiry time and now, if it's less than this, get a new token. Right. Every time you access that headers object. So anytime you're making a fresh call and you specify that object as value for headers, it's going to get a new token if it needs to. It's definitely worth the time of doing it to not have to implement handling for refresh token expiration.
And this is the continuation of that. Last one, authentication request. This time, connect, that was the token that we pulled out. And actually, rather than type it in, I actually copied and pasted it. And then right clicked, boom. And so now we have a user record return. And so this is how easy it is. This is an actual 4-line script where we, instead of typing it all out, because that is awkward, just in curl. Line 1, create token. Line 2, retrieve record. Line 3, line 4, pull the record, authenticate, pull the record, modify. That's all there is to it. And so that whatever client you're using, that's all there is to it. I think we're ready for the next one. Oh.
Yeah, fully. Well, yeah. If you send, if you send both, it will. Yeah, it's gonna say something.
No, this is true. By the way, Kevin's one of the other data implementation consultants.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that you have to be implementation consultant to be in the chat and make comments like this.
Yeah.
It's he just chose to do that. One of the things is to be aware of, although we have all these endpoints where you can do stuff, there's a lot of cool stuff that's actually built in. And one thing that I want to tune you into is that data export has some pretty cool capabilities. For example, you can create data export profiles that will output not just individual fields, but any field like the UUIDs of attached items and holdings and stuff like that. And so like if you're going to do like lots and lots and lots of records and you don't want to have to string the relationships together, it's a good idea to keep track of what kind of functionality has been evolving, because then you don't have to do this programming stuff. You can just have this, just export everything with these properties, boom, shows up like a file, and then, because you can do hybrid UI approaches. And I think that the data export, data import in particular are starting to get to the point where you can do some pretty cool stuff.
And you can script it.
Yeah.
As I always like to say, anything you can accomplish in the UI, you can script.
Yeah.
Because again, everything's calling APIs. So adding business logic APIs can often combine data for you, as you mentioned earlier. So if you feel like what the business logic response gives you is sufficient to be able to do any kind of reporting or analysis, just use that endpoint. Make use of stack codes and inventory if you want to be able to filter and report. That can be a huge win for you. We'll continue here. You have to download records in batches. You can't say, give me 1 million records and it's going to send them all at once. We said that earlier. Some can be downloaded to like 1,000 or even more. I've done calls for some record types where I've said, give me 10,000 records, and it does it.
I actually got 500,000 in one call once. But this is do not try this at home.
Yeah.
But it actually worked. It's because it's all based on like cluster load and a million other things. It's like.
And small records from storage APIs, you can get away with that kind of thing because it's all it is pulling a single field from a column in the PostgreSQL database, and that can be pretty fast. It's a good idea to detect the total number of records you expect. The only way to do that reliably in the APIs in Folio is to do an initial call with a limit of 0, and it will return a JSON object that has a total records value that is the actual count of those records according to that query in the system at the time you executed it. When retrieving those records, you probably want to specify a query that contains cql.allRecords equals 1. This is the start with all records and filter down from their syntax for Folio. And then you can apply additional parameters as you need to. And actually, I think the syntax here is a little bit wrong. The sort is actually comes at the end of the query string. So you do inside your query equals in your URL parameters. If you're putting this together, you kind of ignore that. You just that's the parameter in the URL you want to use. The actual text of the query as a basic thing would be cql.allRecords equals 1, and then space sort by capital B. It may not matter. And then the field you want to sort by after space. And there's some ascending, descending stuff you can do there. For the most part, if you're going to be doing any kind of analysis with this after you pull it out, it's not worth setting the ascending, descending. You can do that in whatever tool you're using, if you feel like you desperately need to do it. And if you're doing manipulation of the data and putting it back, you don't need to sort it anyway. If you need to map UUIDs to meaningful values, if you're not using the business logic APIs to do that for you, that's going to be a separate operation you have to do to retrieve the reference data that has the name corresponding to the UUID. I'll kind of have an example a little bit later where I kind of walk through stuff, and I'm going to show one way to do that. It's just basically build a map and then apply it. But
I think we might have a couple ways. Oh yeah.
Gotchas.
Yeah. You can cause yourself big headaches because when they designed the UI, they didn't say, what if some ninny were to delete things that we think are going to be there.
Relationships matter. Don't delete a record until you deleted all of its dependent relationships. You can use small batches with bulk APIs. We have to get some very conservative here. For a lot of them, you can give it 750 or 1,000. Optimistic locking, as we mentioned earlier, this is a functionality that's in inventory and acquisitions modules. I think it will probably eventually kind of filter its way out through the rest of the system. But this basically sets a version value each time a record is updated. And you have to send back the exact version that you got, that's in the system right now in order to update it. So if after you extract the record via API, someone makes a change to that record through the UI or through some other automated process, that version is going to change on the server. When you try to put that record back, you're going to get an optimistic locking error. You have to then re-extract the record, reapply your changes, and try to put it back again before someone else changes it. It's a race. The API will let you do things that can cause trouble in the UI. Test your code. I get snapshot because if that breaks, actually people care, but it's going to get fixed.
And you can really cause trouble. Like you can make your UI not render, that kind of problem. So that's why you want to test.
A slightly bigger slide on record deletion. I didn't add a delete convenience method to the Python Folio client because I don't like giving people the opportunity to shoot themselves in the foot. If you want to delete a record, write that in an HTTP use request or HTTPX or something to actually execute that itself. It's just you need to really think about what you're doing when you're going to do that. Folio does not enforce referential integrity for records for the most part, especially across modules. Inventory has some referential integrity. If you try to delete an instance record that has dependent holdings and items, you won't be able to do it. There's no UI mechanism for deleting instances right now for two reasons. One, SRS relationship. So if you've got a markback instance record and you delete that instance record, you'd have an SRS mark record sitting in the database that has no no instance representation in the system. So no real way to find it in the UI. Just regular instances could be deleted, no problem. But if you have any holdings or items, they'd be orphaned as well. And you don't want that to happen. You need to check your external references, whenever you're deleting items. That's something that you have to do yourself. Folio won't do it for you. Hopefully at some point we'll get soft deletes in Folio and you can just say delete, and then the system will actually delete the records whenever it's all the references to it and other records are gone. Be especially careful with instances, items, and users. These are the 3 records most likely to cause you significant problems in the UI if you're deleted. Some delete endpoints support CQL queries. So you can say delete to a base endpoint, give it a CQL query, and in theory, it will delete all those records that match that query. If the query is too large, on the other hand, the results is too big, yeah, it can cause problems. You could get a situation where it deletes some of the records, but not all of them.
So it is possible through API to delete the instance record and the associated mark record?
Yes.
Okay.
The way that you would do that is you're going to want to query SRS to get the, you'll need to get the SRS record before, you'll have to get retrieve the SRS record before you delete the instance, because otherwise you will not be able to call the SRS except for ID or by some other weird search.
Yeah, and deletion of actually deleting the SRS record is a bit.
You're not really deleting it.
Yeah.
It's putting a delete marker on it, but you're still going to want to do it on UUID. The way you're going to do it is you're going to delete the holdings before you delete the instance, because you have to, and when you have the holdings, you will know the instance because you have the holdings, and because you have the instance, you can pull the SRS by instance ID, which gives you the SRS ID, and then you can delete them all.
Are you confused?
I know, so it marks the SRS record for deletion, so it is still kind of hanging out there.
Yes,
And
and there's reasons for that, because if you were to actually delete the SRS record, that's how it gets out to discoveries. It has a delete marker in it. Then OAI PMH says, oh, like one of the calls I got today was an institution like 40,000, the catalog dropped by 40,000. So I get this desperate ping, catalog dropped by 40,000. It's like, is this expected? I was like, yes, it's expected. I deleted 40,000 things for them. And if they don't panic, because otherwise the user could say, oh, there's not 40,000 things, but instead the library is like, finally, they got rid of these 40,000 things we don't want to see. But that's why it marks it for deletion rather than actually deleting it.
Yeah, in Ramson's, there will be a mark instance record for deletion API endpoint and operation that you can perform via the UI even to mark a record for deletion. And that will, it sets the SRS record to deletion, and it applies the staff suppress flag to the record itself, and staff suppress will actually work. Up to this point, you can set the staff suppress field, but it does nothing. It's a way to filter.
It says staff suppress.
It says staff suppress, and it's a way to filter the records, but in Ramson's,
It will actually work.
it will actually work. So you'll have to have the permission to view staff suppressed records in inventory to see those records in inventory. Yeah.
So you just mentioned permissions, and that got me thinking. So you said that every user is an API user.
Correct.
Okay, so at my institution, I have a variety of staff who do things at different levels. Will permissions that are applied to a user in the UI, so for example, I'm going in, I'm setting up my permission user groups. If I ask people to start using API keys, does business logic not work and they can just run wild with scissors, or are my permissions still enabled?
The permissions are going to be exactly the same.
Okay.
So like, for example, if you have a circ desk worker and they can check things in and out, but they are not able to, like modify inventory.
Right.
Let's suppose they get into your Postman collection, which has absolutely everything in it, including delete your entire database. What they'll be able to do is they'll be able to check things in and out, because that's all their user will let them do. And if they try the others, it will say, you need permission, inventory, post, or something like that.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, we're good. I was just gonna confuse things further. We're coming up on one of the questions, like the stop for questions section. So we kind of have just a list here of just community tools for working with the API. So you've got the Working with APIs guide, the Learning APIs channel, some links to Postman information. These are all in the slides. So the Linux command line tools that we showed earlier, the Python client, and brand new, announcing it today, there is a rudimentary PowerShell module for interacting with Folio that is modeled on the Python Folio client library. It handles creating the session, managing the tokens. That's about all it does right now. Creating a PowerShell class and dealing with PowerShell objects is not for the faint of heart, and there's some very weird design decisions that were made in the implementation of those things. But there are, it basically supplies the class that you can instantiate to do all of the things that Folio client, managing the token session. It has get, put, post, and delete. Didn't want to do it, but calling the normal like HTTP operations in is not way more complicated than it is in Python, and so it's like the convenience versus pain level here is too high. This is in the same project in GitHub as the rest of our the Folio client stuff. It is also published to the PowerShell, basically the PowerShell equivalent of PyPI. So you put the package index where you can go out and get a package and get a module and install it on your machine. You probably have to have IT's permission to do this, but PowerShell is on all Windows computers. So it is something that you at least have available to you and can say, hey, IT, I would like this one PowerShell module installed on my computer. Can you please do that? So.
First question, Rick, there'll be more.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm going way back to the beginning.
Okay.
When you're talking about storage APIs, you said mark authority for now. Is that API changing or?
The markup,
No, there was some back-end stuff that authorities, the Folio representation of the authority record, the JSON representation of the authority record used to live in inventory.
Okay.
I mean, the inventory module was split out in Poppy.
I think it's possible.
Yeah, in Poppy it moved to its own, in the mod entities links module maintains that now. The source record storage still lives in mod source record storage.
Which has implications when you're doing mass operations on.
Yeah, and there will be a bulk authorities creation and update endpoint in Ramses. Finally.
Authorities is fun topic
Yeah.
in itself. It's on.
I still, we've done this so many times. I highly recommend if you're doing authorities, use data import.
Yeah.
Use data import. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
We're talking about optimistic locking. So
Yeah.
if you see a version number in the record and you're doing a put, you have to update that version?
No,
Oh.
it has to be the exact same value it was in the record you pulled out.
Okay, got it. So just-
So underscore version,
Yeah,
and then
Number one,
yeah,
number seven.
don't touch it.
okay,
Get the record out, update the record, but do not touch the version.
okay.
Yeah, I highly recommend if you're doing a wholesale like replace of that record, create copy that version to a new object and then update that object from whatever object you want to use to replace it. Because the version needs to be there.
No version forward.
Yeah, there's no way to save lives. Anyway, no, that's a pain point I don't want to talk about. So any other questions?
This is a newbie question, but, so say we want a list of all items in a certain location in Postman, you get like the total number of records and then it will only show you like 10.
Right.
And I know like some of the endpoints, there are limits, but do you have any tricks? Like
Well-
I play around with the offset and the limit.
We'll
I just
get to that. And if you can bring yourself to use, I'll show you this here. I'll show you something here in a second, and it may be useful for you. So
Okay.
especially if you're doing inventory type operations.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the things
I've been teaching myself a different computer language, R. Is what I've learned about R in the last couple of years, is that going to help me with any of these things, or should I start again? With Python?
It should be applicable. I mean, the kind of thing you might want to ask about. I've never worked in R. I don't know how it, you know, what kind of HTTP communication libraries it has available to it. I'm assuming it has some. But all you need to be able to do is send that request to get the token, store the token, and then add it to a header when you send back requests. So I recommend taking a look at the Folio client Python library. I try to comment the code to make sure you can understand what's going on there. And you can kind of see, you'll see the URLs. I mean, the endpoints are there, it's as strings in the code, so you can see what's being called, and the methods have descriptive names and stuff. So I think it's useful for someone who is relatively comfortable reading programming languages to go in and view. Python is very readable. That's one of the main design decisions in the way it's built.
Thanks.
Yeah. Anything else?
By the way, you're mentioning that, you know, like you're getting like a very short list for stuff like items. I usually pull in 1,000 at a time on 5 streams simultaneously. So you can.
In Postman, it's a little hard. Doing anything simultaneous and in parallel in Postman is a kind of a bear. There was one of our colleagues a while back that built a process for doing user import through Postman, but it was 1 record at a time. So you were using the bulk APIs to do a single record load of this data, just because that allowed you to build from a CSV without having to resolve the reference data. But it was really slow and made me weep inside.
And we didn't want to see him cry. So. Yeah, but depending on what you're doing, it can be worth, you know, if you're doing something only once, it doesn't matter how you do it. But if you're like regularly doing things, it can be worth kind of like figuring out what's the limits of how I can do it, what potential mechanisms do I have. One of the there's 2 reasons that we're a Python shop, but one of the reasons I specifically tend to do a lot of like Linux type stuff is that threading is just so much easier. It's brain dead. And then the other thing is the JSON, arbitrary JSON transformation is because the thing that we need to do more often than anything else is look at and do arbitrary one-off examination and manipulation of JSON. So being able to do that like fast is handy.
Yeah. As you mentioned, this is Postman. This is kind of what that collection that we had linked earlier. If you load that, you click on that link, it's going to open a web browser that looks just like this. The page in a web browser looks just like this. But you can also download the Postman API client. Or you can, if you log into that page, create an account and log into that web page, you can do all the same stuff there as well. But we've got some basic calls and we've got the environments configured. So we've got the Bug-Best Quiznalia non-ECS environment, and we've got snapshot environments configured. There are some things here. Basically, the collection at the collection level is configured to run a pre-request script that actually handles all of the authentication, getting the token and setting the token as an environment variable for you. I'm hoping to actually get this updated. This is actually created by one of our colleagues, Christine McClure, who's an LSE with EBSCO.
LSE, Library Services Engineer.
Yes. Anyway, I recently wrote a modification of that pre-request call that handles token expiration and refresh for you. Stores all the token expiration stuff so it knows when to request a new token. But that hasn't been added to this yet. An basic inventory call. So let's count instances. Again, you've got the base URL. Right now we don't have an environment active, so this is kind of a reddish color that indicates there's no variable resolved for that. But if I activate my environment here, it activated. That changed to kind of a yellow color. I mouse over it. It's going to show the values for there. I just hit send here. It's a GET request, so I hit send. And it's going to. This was very slow for me yesterday too.
Oh, it's probably It's got a lot of stuff in it, you can get like low performance.
Oh, yeah, there's 8 million response,
Yeah.
that's why it took a little while.
I'll do a tenant information, we'll give you,
Anyway,
but,
yeah,
well, hopefully I mean, the Bug Fest, the whole point of Bug Fest is we collaborate and so does everybody else, and so, you can do experiments on it, and so if it doesn't work well, it could be because everybody's collaborating with crazy experiments.
yeah, but we could also we could switch environments.
Yeah.
And run this again, snapshot instead of Bugfest and 1063.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the basics of doing API calls within Postman.
You wanna show the environment thing just to see what it looks like?
Oh, yeah, sorry, anyway, this is
So,
that screenshot we had up earlier that, if you're doing your actual folio system, never set your password if you're putting it in that initial value column. Leave that empty and only enter it in the current value column. That will, if you're doing any kind of sharing of this, that doesn't get shared in the collections. But things in the initial value field do. If you're sharing your workspace, you can share. This is a specific workspace within Postman. Any questions here? We've got quite a bit else to cover, and definitely we'll reach out on, again, as we said, Learn APIs channel after this, and we're there to help answer questions and stuff there. But I do want to kind of cover a few more things here before we. Using Python to talk to the Folio APIs, I've got a link to Google Collab. Google Collab is a way to run what are called Jupyter notebooks. It's basically an environment for kind of interactively and in a documented way building workbooks or notebooks of code. It's a really awesome way of working with, especially doing prototyping and just kind of familiarizing yourself with, and working directly with APIs is a great way to do it. Google Collab has a free level. Biggest trick here is your data privacy and protection stuff may not allow you to do certain types of operations in this system. Even doing the keys and tokens may be too much. There are more secure ways to do it, but it can still be problematic. These are ephemeral like environments, like virtual machines that are spun up in Google's cloud infrastructure. They're actually pretty powerful in terms of the resources allocated to them, I feel like, even at the free level. So they're just short-lived. So if they time out after a while. So if any kind of long-range operation, you couldn't do it here. But you can download this as a regular Jupyter notebook and run it on your machine. You just have to kind of do some Jupyter setup, and there's stuff like Google set up Jupyter notebook environment, and there's a lot of ways to do it. The kind of first thing here is you make sure that you have your prerequisites. So this is installing all of the kind of libraries that we need to do this operations. The first one there is Folio client, and we've got some data science analysis libraries, PyMark, then some Excel libraries for dealing with Excel stuff. It'll take a minute for this all to install. Just ignore that once that's done. Okay, a little green checkbox, 22 seconds to do that. Then we need to import the libraries that we want to use. This line does. Okay, and then we want to authenticate to Folio. We need to instantiate a Folio client object. So the way to do that is to take a variable, Folio client.folio client, and then you supply the URL, tenant ID, username, and password. I recommend using getPass, which is kind of a way of doing secure text input. When you do that with the command line, it's going to prompt you for the password at the command line. If you do it here, it's going to pop up a little box asking me the password. This is Bugfest, so it's Folio. Okay, green checkbox, we've got a folio client object called FC that we can use down here. The folio client object, again, offers several convenience methods for interacting with Folio, rather than having to drop down to a lower level HTTP library like requests or HTTPX or AIO HTTP. It does offer a convenience method to instantiate a HTTPX client. The Folio client library uses HTTPX as its underlying HTTP library. Give you the reasons for that one time. But you can have these convenience methods, or you can instantiate a client that you can use for subsequent requests that helps you not have a bunch of connections randomly being generated. Let's use Folio Get to retrieve some instance records. This is going to use the search API. So you've got get instances. We're assigning the results of this call to a variable, and we're running this call. So we've got the search instances endpoint. We're looking at the instances sub-object within. That's just an array of results. This lets, if we didn't specify that, the value here for get instances would be the entire response. So it would be everything, including total records. So if that's what you want, then that's fine. Remove that key value and just set the query to be what you want it to be. I'm going against Bugfest. I'm going to search for title got Emperor of Dune. Success. We got something back. We can take a look at this example record. That get instance object again. It's the list of the Folio instance record returned by the search. We want to actually get the instance record from storage now because we want to make an edit to it. The response, again, I have it printing the JSON response out here. You can kind of scroll up and you can see the whole record. Screen brightness all the way down. I'm like looking at that. But anyway, you scroll down here. The next part we wanted, this is the JSON object. Say we want to modify the title of this record and then put it back. This, you wouldn't do this normally because this is a marked back record, but you can do it, but the next time the record gets updated, it's going to get overwritten by the marked instance map. So this is a pretty safe operation to do, just to kind of play around and show how update works. I'm adding an emoji character to the end of the title. And it's going to print the example. You'll see it has the title field, it's got the little caterpillar. This is an in-joke if you know God Emperor of Dune. You're going to scroll down here, but we're going to update that in Bugfest. So just call the folio put method. We give it the endpoint we want to put, and we give it the object we want to put in there. Python lets you basically deserialize JSON objects into Python dictionaries, and it's kind of a direct back and forth. And the HTTP library handles all the translation of those into the correct object types. Right, run that and success. Now we want to take a look at the updated example so we can see if that actually worked. So we're going to do a get again, get storage. It's going to print out. So now, hey, look, caterpillar. How do we create a new record? So again, here there are required fields in an instance record. There are 3 of them: source, title, and instance ID type. The Folio client objects provide a convenience method, as a convenience attribute called instance types, which basically retrieves the current instance type reference data from your system. What I'm doing here is it's called I can't remember what it's called now. Basically, it's an inline dictionary construction. Basically, I'm looping over the results, the objects and their results, and building a dictionary that maps the code value that I know to the ID values that I need to include in the instance record. The default instance type is ZZZ, so it's the unknown instance type. So if we run this, it's going to build the map and then give me the ID value for that ZZZ. So then I just construct a new object that includes source, title, and instance type. It's going to print. And then if I want to post that folio, I just run the same thing. It gives me, when you do a post, it gives you the response back of the record that it created most of the time. You put no, put you're gonna get a 204 and no content back. So that's why when we did those puts earlier, we had to run a new get to get the response. What we see now, there are 2 copies of this instance in Folio, because I did this earlier as well. People at the Bugfest, there's now 2 electric boogaloo retrieve. Kind of some reporting basics. So great, we know how to get and create and modify objects in Python. But what if we want to run some reports? We want to do that query like you're talking about, where we get all the records back and do some kind of analysis based on an attribute of those records. In this context, I would use a data science library. That's a way to take the data you get out of Folio and kind of turn it into tabular type data that you can, like you could output it as Excel and run your analysis in Excel if you wanted to, but a lot of these record sets can get really big and Excel is not great at really large data sets. That's one thing that these data science libraries are built for, is manipulating large and analyzing large data sets. So kind of as an example of a report that folks kind of ask for fairly frequently, if you allow recalls, a lot of folks want to analyze who's having their items recalled. What patron groups are most affected or impacted by us allowing recalls. So we want to get the loans and we want to call the circulation business logic endpoint, because it's going to resolve a lot of the reference data, things like patron group name, for instance. Because the loan record stores the patron group ID at checkout. So the ID, the patron group ID of the patron, when they check the item out, is always stored in the loan record in Folio. So it's always there. Even once the loan is anonymized, we don't have the direct link to the patron anymore. You can see what patron group they were in when they check that item out. So we run this, and we're going to basically, there's a bug in the way the library I like to use works. So I'm having to do this kind of weird dance here, just kind of ignore that. You can, there's a link to this, you can download this and kind of look at it and kind of play around. And I have a link to the Polars documentation earlier, a little higher up. But I'm going to pull this out. I've got it. Whoops, I'm going to stop this because this takes forever. I'm going to change this date to 2021. There's a lot fewer loans in Bugfest that match these criteria. I'm only querying for things that due date changed by recall to true. That's the indication that the loan has been recalled. Much smaller data set. Okay, that is done. So I've got a data frame, which is basically the tabular data representation that I can analyze. So I'm going to just kind of preview and show you what's available or columns wise are available in that record. I ran ahead on it. So it's the first 5 rows. And then this is taking all the fields down 2 levels deep in the object and turning them into columns. So anything that's a sub object is going to be delineated by a dot in this. So you've got status, which is a sub object in the record, status.name, metadata, all those areas there. We can use this Polars data frame to count how many times each patron group is associated with a recalled loan. So we're going to select, we only care about that one column, what's the patron group name. So we're going to select that group, select that column. We're going to convert it to a series, which is a special representation of data that has this method called value count. So there's other ways to do this. You can do group bys in the data frame and get the same results, but I always find this a little bit more straightforward to do. And there's comments here to kind of, if you dig into this later, there's comments describing what's going on here. And it's going to sort by count descending. And here's your results. And you can output this. This gets truncated because of the way it displays in here, but you can write this out to a CSV file if you wanted to get the actual report. You can do in Excel later. But it's list patron name, patron group name, and how many times they've been recalled out of the recalled loans. How about circulation by service points? We've got that same data set, and we want to analyze what service point is doing the most circulation of recalled loans. Same deal. And you've got the same kind of results. If you wanted to analyze this in Excel, Polars offers you the ability to write out to CSV and Excel. If you're in Collab and you run this, it's going to put things into this little file guy here. If you're running on your computer locally, and you run it with this exact same syntax, it's gonna write the file to wherever this notebook lives. Okay, that's the basics for that. Pretty quick one to run through. Any questions? We could do this. We have a presentation that ran this all entire day. Toyed with submitting this as a workshop, but would have been a little daunting to do that at the beginning of the week. Okay, switch back to the presentation real quick. I'm going to skip the PowerShell demo. It's not super impressive right now. Just know that if you go out to the link and look at it, there is a lot of inline, comment documentation in the code. So you want to know how it works. We're running out of time. That's fine. Question section again. Anything? So kind of this is the end of the presentation. So what are the kind of the inspiration? We want to inspire you to do things with this. So what are the kinds of things that you can do with the APIs? What kind of tools can you build? The migration tools that we use to migrate customer data to a new system, to a new Folio system from their legacy system, is built using the API tools. That the Folio client exists for that reason. That's why it exists, to power this library. I've just built a new library that I'm begin incorporating into migration tools called Folio Data Import. But this actually provides script commands that are separate from migration tools that allow you to directly address the source records, the change manager APIs in data import, which lets you kind of stream records in without having to create a file and upload that to the data import UI and have it parcel up the records. You can control the size of the batches and tune them to your environment to make them work the way you want to do it. I'd love to do a demo of that, but don't know. Suffice it to say, it's a nice little interactive thing. You give it a file of mark records or file of files, and you can give it you can go to a folder and give the glob where it matches multiple files in a directory, and it will process all of them and load them either as separate jobs in data import or all as one. And basically it manages cutting up the records and streaming them into the system for you. And it presents a prompt to you if you're doing it interactively that lists all of the available import profiles for you to use, and you can select from that list to specify them. There's also a user import script in there as well that I got tired of my user import crashing on me as I was loading records in because there were too many bad records in the batches I was loading because. So I basically re-implemented mod user import the way it works. All the things it does, this script does. So it looks for existing records, it updates existing records, it respects the update only present fields, and it does it completely. The only thing that gets completely overwritten if you don't include it is an address, because there's no way, the way the addresses part work, there's no way to do it otherwise. But it resolves all the reference data, the patron groups, the address types, all of that's done, handles departments as well. It'll take custom fields. The only thing it doesn't do that mod user import currently does is allow you to manage and add departments or add custom field values, which you can do through mod user imports payloads. But other than that, the script will accept a JSON lines file, so basically one user object per line in the text file, and process it. That's the way that our migration tools generate records for loading during the migration process. So if you use the Folio migration tools to generate your user objects that you load, you can then just take that output file and supply it to that user import script in the Folio data import module and have it just run through. There are also other, Caltech has built an entire user interface system for doing maintenance operations on their data in Folio. It's written in Python, but it has a UI. It's called Foliage. Getting it to work can be a little tricky, but it's just kind of an example of the kind of things you can do. If you wanted to, you could build an entire Stripes-based, separate Stripes-based system that does all of this. I'm aware of some people that are actually doing that. And you've got, again, Kyle's Linux command line utilities. You know, those are the examples of the kinds of things that you can do. And that's really it. We're coming right up on time. Thank you very much for being here and thank you very much for tolerating our extremely fast talking and here at the very end, there's some of this is repeats from earlier, but I kind of wanted to pull this all together at one place here at the end of the presentation, just to kind of places to go to get help or find out more information about the APIs and some of the stuff we covered in the presentation.